if you can be so kind to hit record.
All right, we're recording.
Okay. So can everyone see my screen? Or can someone see my screen?
Yep.
Yep. All right. So this is the SIG Auth meeting for Wednesday, April 19th, 2007. As in terms of pull requests of note that have happened since last time, it's been a relatively quiet couple weeks for auth-related PRs. A couple of these are still open from last time, notably the role that will give all users access to read things like storage classes. We're still looking for a name for that. So if you have any opinions, hopefully somebody was going to send something to the SIG Auth mailing list. Other than that, the only one that I really tracked down was the reducing the allocations by the RBAC authorizer. This is a little bit more into the API machinery side of things, but will hopefully reduce the memory usage of the RBAC authorizer, specifically when things are hitting it that are getting lots of denial requests. Other than that, unless anybody else has some PRs of note that they'd like to call out here, I didn't see anything else.
And just for the allocation thing, that's part of the path to V1, just getting the final scalability numbers down. That was an issue that it was found during 1.6, and it wasn't a blocker, but we needed to get that done before we can promote to V1.
Yeah. Cool. And in terms of design notes, there's been a few that have been sent out recently. Is anyone here to discuss this first one? I see that there's 10 minutes allocated for it. If not, hopefully somebody.
Sorry, what is the first, for those who can't see the screen, what is the first one?
Oh, the first one is the enterprise control for Kubernetes. It's titled on the meeting notes. I can actually.
This is Eric. I'm here to discuss that, but the two other people are not. Can we move that down, and then I'll try to round those people up?
Yeah, sounds great. We'll just follow up with it later. The other ones that I put here were the one that got sent to the SIG Auth mailing list pretty recently about proposing the way that we might do auth setup for federated control planes. This is actually spun out of a separate document that was maybe a more overarching thing, and this is specifically talking about proposals around how federation might act as particular users when talking to the underlying clusters. So if I create something in the federated API control plane, how does the fact that I created that translate to, how that federated API server actually talks to the underlying clusters that is trying to create actual resources on. I know that, Gil, you're actually on.
Yeah.
Would you want to take a few moments and talk about that and maybe, give us some overall comments?
Yeah. So what you said is a very great summary. We want to decide what identity should the federation control plane use while sending requests to the underlying clusters. And this specific proposal proposes that we allow multiple implementations, and the two primary ones that we want to support is a single identity where the federation control plane uses a single identity to send all requests to underlying clusters. And the other one is called user identity. So it impersonates the user which triggered that request. So if a user creates the replica set and federation control plane creates that same replica set in all the underlying clusters, the federation control plane will use the identity of the user that created federated replica set. And we are going to add it says federation identity provider, and there can be multiple implementations of it, which is similar to we have an authorization mode flag in Kubernetes right now, and we can add other implementations as well. So similarly, this design proposes a new flag, and you can set different values.
And I didn't actually see this. Was this just limited to authentication rather than authorization, or was there discussion of trying to sort of have the federated API control plane also managing in aspects of the auth-Z side?
No. So this doesn't talk about that, but we have a separate proposal where we want to support RBAC in the Federation API as well. So that way, even if you create RBAC rules in Federation control plane, they'll be synced across all the clusters. So that's a way to ensure that you have same auth rules in all your cluster, authorization rules in all your clusters. And that is a separate issue, not discussed in this one. This is more about what identity should the Federation control plane use to send those requests to the link.
I know the per user, where the Federation control plane replays requests as the user that created the resource or updated the resource. That is kind of going over territory that we touched on in the main control plane, where people were wanting an annotation or an attribute on an object that would track the user that created it or the user that updated it.
Yes.
And up until now, we've stayed away from that because it's problematic. I see this as proposing to store it as an annotation on objects.
Yes. And in fact, what we had discussed before was per field annotation, so that we track which user updated each field. But this proposal says like we start with just like a resource owner, so and per resource owner rather than per field. So at least that is simplified. But yes, it still proposes adding an annotation to the resource which we track this.
Yeah, it's a little concerning that just touching an object means your powers are going to be used to replay that object. So if a user that is not allowed to create something on the underlying cluster creates it in the Federation cluster, and then that thing keeps getting rejected by the underlying cluster because the user is not allowed to, and then someone else labels stuff, the labels get applied. Technically, they updated the object. Now they are the last updater, and now the cluster is going to start trying to create it or the Federation controller is going to start trying to create it in the underlying cluster as them.
Yeah. So the understanding there is the user's intent was, like the second user's intent was also that this replica set should exist with this label. So that is the desired state from the second user, that this replica set should exist with this label. So that is what Federation control plane is doing for that user. So
but I might have a controller that's only job is to literally label everything, and I guess to Jordan's point, the intent there is certainly not that this is okay by my controller all of a sudden,
or even that anyone who is updating anything in the Federation plane must have update rights in the underlying cluster. It's really subtle. Yeah. I think it's. So
for the second point, the point you're making for the second point, if the admin wants to set up the auth setup in this way, that if a user creates a resource in the Federation control plane, the same user should have authorization to do it in the underlying control plane, underlying clusters, and only then that request will succeed. Then they'll use like the user identity mode. If they don't want this, they can use a single identity mode where Federation is authorized to create resources in underlying clusters, and user just needs the authorization to create resources in Federation. And then Federation creates it in underlying clusters using its own identity. So then
do any of the Federation controllers write status back to Federation objects?
Yes, they do.
Then won't they immediately become the updating user?
Yeah, that is a good point.
So why doesn't the Fed, like, if I want to invite, suppose I had no Federation. Mm-hmm. And so it's Eric's job to like make sure there's always 3 replica sets in all 3 of our data centers, clusters. And let's say I have to go on vacation. So I'm like, hey, Matt, in case we get a new data center, while I'm on vacation, can you add a fourth one? And so I give Matt permission to do it. Now let's say like Matt and I both want to go on vacation, so we want a robot to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So then we would give a service count for that robot to do the job.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's basically what a federation controller is a robot that does that job, making sure there's things in all the places.
Right, and that's
so that
that's the first.
I would create a service count in my namespace called like for use by federation controller, and I would give that credentials or access to that for that service account to federation somehow.
Yeah, that's
what I expect, and that's one of the two ways that the federation control plane is being proposed to operate.
Yes. So for this use case, the way you'll sort of configure your federation is using single identity. You'll just provide, like, federation should always use that for federation service account for all the requests that it sends to underlying cluster. And
no, I'm saying that like for each namespace that it needs to act in, it would have a different one.
Per namespace, per underlying cluster.
Yes.
Yes.
So that is what the
single identity. Right now, single identity proposes single identity per cluster, not per cluster per namespace. But that is also possible. I mean, we can extend it.
Seems like per cluster per namespace addresses a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And I think, and this was in one of the other things, I just wanted to bring it up for the folks who haven't heard this. Like, one of the things that is important over the long term is that the model that one federation, if compromised, can compromise every underlying cluster is a very dangerous one, and is not that risky when you're talking about a small set of people accessing both the cluster and the federation. But the larger the clusters get and the larger the federation gets, it basically becomes untenable to do that. So the namespace robot federation model, per namespace per cluster model at the largest scales is something that we need to take very seriously as the default or a recommendation.
And I would expect that even without federation, as we start adding more like crazy types of controllers through aggregated APIs, they will probably want per namespace annotations for those controllers to act in people's namespaces, because people that like do an audit and decide, okay, I trust Kubernetes, they're not going to just suddenly want things to appear out of thin air that now have control over their namespace where they haven't audited that code.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to need per namespace credential key rings for controllers, even outside of federation.
Yeah. So I'd like to add one more point that, yes, we do want the mode that Eric is talking about, but there's also another case. Like when Eric set up federation only for himself, in that case, he can give like a specific for federation service account to federation. But what if, like in his example, Eric and Matt both want to use federation, but for different purposes, like multi-tenancy in federation. There are two different teams who want to use federation. So we don't want federation to use a single identity for all, like for when it's acting on behalf of both of them. So that's why we want to propagate user identity. And in the underlying cluster,
I think per namespace gets you there, because if you've got two different teams using federation for two different purposes, and one team is working with one set of namespaces and another team is working with another set, then each one can have a set of namespaces with different credentials, but it's still a per namespace per underlying cluster credential.
Yes, but there could be multiple people in the same team as well, acting on the same namespace.
It might be helpful to review some of the one thread that actually was going to introduce this annotation to the core control plane. The actual decision was not even to not even add the information about who created a particular object, because people felt that it was easy to get wrong or act upon incorrectly. And I think that articulated pretty well sort of a lot of the concerns around these type of patterns of, labeling this person created the object and therefore I'm going to make decisions based off of that.
Yes. But I think the Kubernetes controller model is a bit different, because there the understanding is that it is part of the system. So like if the like the Kubernetes system accepted my resource once, then the system components are acting to make the desired state happen, and they don't need my identity. Like system has already accepted my input. But federation is sort of like above the system. We want the underlying clusters to be able to do authorization as well. Like they should not just trust that federation accepted my replica set and now federation is creating like pods or replica sets in underlying clusters. They want to do authorization that does Nikhil have access to create replica sets in these underlying clusters. Otherwise, they are trusting federation to have done the right authorization.
Well, they're trusting federation either way. They're trusting federation either to have done the authorization or to have done the authentication and correctly attribute the object and have power to impersonate the user. So either way, you're trusting federation.
If you can treat a robot to do something for you, you're trusting the robot to do the things that you said the robot could do, and you give up control over the details of how the robot does it, because it's very hard to audit why a robot does something.
So I agree that underlying clusters are still trusting federation for authentication, but they're not trusting it for authorization.
They are. They're trusting that you have access to the federated namespace and all that kind of stuff, right?
I didn't understand that.
So I guess I would say, like, if you have a federation that has a security breach, the assumption is that everything that was on that federation is compromised. And so the containment mental model usually applies, which is if you're concerned about a security breach between two groups, those two groups shouldn't be able to security breach and affect the other. And the way you would do that is run different federations, right? For whatever your threat model is. So there's some level of, the more that you have to worry about the robot getting confused or the robot being compromised, is the solution isn't to make the robot more complex. The solution is to partition the robots and make it easy to bound the domains of what they can do, right?
But for federation, I would say one of our goal is also like providing a single pane of glass rather than you having to go through multiple endpoints. We are also doing stuff like single point for policy enforcement. Like some people or some deployments can only go to Europe clusters or not to Asia clusters, and some production jobs can only go to some specific clusters. So we are having those policy enforcement as well. So we want to have a single federation rather than divide them into multiple.
No, I don't think that. I mean, I think you're right. Like, there's no you can keep adding things to a federation to let the federation be a single pane of glass until the impact of a compromise becomes too great, and then you split it. That's all I was trying to highlight was single pane of glass is great until single pane of glass lets you root your entire business and destroy it in a single button. So the trade-off is usually you give up the central logon and the central control for you do central sign-on, and then each cluster is still bounded in a more concrete domain.
Yeah, I agree with that point, but I also want to say that there should be a right balance. So we won't say like we won't support multi-tenancy at all in federation. You always have to split.
Right.
But we also won't have, like you said, like a single place for.
Right. And I think I was just kind of highlighting the impersonation model adds a lot of complexity on the client side and doesn't reduce the probability that there's a confused deputy problem much, and it doesn't limit the security impact of compromising the federation. What it does do is ensure that there's a clear audit trail from the federation down into the cluster, but there's potentially other ways to solve that too.
Yeah, but I do think it does help with the confused deputy problem as well, because right now it's using the user's identity, and if the user doesn't have authorization in the underlying cluster, it won't go through. Like if I create a replica set in one namespace or in multiple namespaces, or I have access to only one namespace, but because of a bug in federation, it decides that replica set would be propagated in all namespaces, that request will fail because it's using my identity and I have access only to one namespace. And I'm not sure how the namespace specific identity would help with confused deputy as well, because if names or federation has access to 5 different namespaces, the confused deputy can still lead to a bug affecting all those 5 namespaces. Because Federation does have access to those 5 namespaces, it will use the corresponding identity to send those requests in each of those 5 namespaces, and all of them would succeed.
But are there more bugs in that direction? So we have to fix those bugs regardless anyway. If we have a complex way of assigning who did what that adds more bugs, are we more secure or less secure? And I think that's the trade-off is there's just as many ways that the field level tracking can go wrong.
Yeah, so I would like to specifically point that this proposal doesn't say field level tracking. It just talks about a single owner for each object.
I mean, this introduced another issue, which is that different clusters think of users differently. I think that's a good example of where tracking users actually does add a lot more complexity in terms of the setup and having to say, in their initial proposal, there was an actual thing saying, we're going to keep track of this user actually means this user if you're talking to this cluster. It seems like the biggest concern here is that this is sort of a rabbit hole that we're going to go down that doesn't really have a clean or even a correct, possibly, answer.
So I was going to add, the mental idea that you have to be able to act as both yourself and the actor. I mean, we could certainly assuming you have a robot account on each of the individual clusters, a service account or whatever, that is materialized up into the federation through credentials or whatever, and is granted RBAC access to the clusters. There's nothing that necessarily prevents us from adding an additional layer on top in the federation that says, before you can even edit, you must still have access in that namespace for you to do edit actions on the underlying cluster, which defends against the class of action of, you at the federation level had access and it was taken away, but the federation still lets you in. And that's kind of if we make those the intersection, we might do more access control checks, but it adds another layer of, you defend against the possibility that the user shouldn't have access to the federation, and you require them to have access to the underlying cluster.
Yes, so that is also something we had discussed. One of the problems there is, at the authorization, when Federation does authorization, it doesn't know what subset of clusters is this request going to be. We also have a concept of cluster selector. You can create a replica set, let's say in only Asia clusters. So you can say this replica set will go to all clusters that have the label region Asia. So authorizer doesn't know about cluster selector, and there are some the policies I talked about earlier which are applied by admission controller.
I'm going to say that I think you start getting into those scenarios, and somebody who has access to a namespace that has access to lots of clusters where you're trying to prevent the person in that namespace from accessing those underlying clusters, or you're already kind of in a weird spot, which is you trust them enough to destroy entire applications, but then you're worried about them, there's some level of the defense that we want to worry about is accidental bugs, but we should try to, in the federation, give the users exactly the permission that you need to accomplish their job. And auditing who can access a namespace, and this gets into some of the other discussions we've been having recently, there are advantages to auditing who can have access to a namespace and intersecting that with who can access any of the clusters that namespace can access, versus trying to get more fine-grained and potentially confusing people in the audit process.
I just keep coming back to, if I want to federate something, federate my cluster, and I hook up my cluster to the federation server, and then have to go figure out all the objects that have already been created in the federation server and who they were created by, and make sure those users have permissions in my underlying cluster. I just have a really hard time envisioning that being what I want. Maybe I'm unimaginative.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how much control do you want. Is it that if you've added your cluster to the federation, then you're fine with federation adding everything that it wants to your cluster. You want to have control over what subset of those or which all of those resources do make up into your cluster. So then you explicitly want to give access to users to your clusters. If not, if you don't want the control, you just give the federation identity. Use the single identity model and give federation access to some namespaces on your cluster, and all those objects in those namespaces make up to your cluster as well.
Yeah.
It depends on which model do you want. And the proposal is to support both. But I guess some of the comments I'm getting is you're saying these user identity is not as valuable, like maybe admins don't want it.
I mean, it adds a lot of complexity, and it requires a lot of trust in the federation server to allow impersonation. And you start to get into like the user identity mapping stuff where if you have different auth methods for federation and underlying clusters, then you have to map between one provider and another provider. Like it just seems like the number of issues it introduces are perhaps more than it is worth.
So for the federated identity, or like mapping the identity scenario, which was brought up earlier as well, I was looking at the comments on the enterprise control for K8s, the other discussion which was supposed to happen as well, and there I saw a comment that I agree that most people would want federated identity. I know that discussion has happened at other places as well, that maybe most people have like the same identity provider across clusters. The authorization can vary and quota can vary, but they'll still keep the same identity across all the clusters. At least that's the feedback I'm getting, that's the most common scenario. And if that is the case, then we won't need this identity. And
just to make sure that it seems like this conversation can go on for a while, just to make sure that we have time for the other items that are here. Can we?
So I'll just sort of complete by saying one sentence, I'd like to summarize that this proposal doesn't is a small subset. It doesn't, in the first milestone, we are not saying we'll implement this whole user identity, because the majority scenario, at least what it seems to me, is that people would have federated identity and we won't need that mapping. And similarly, it doesn't say we won't have field-based tracking. It just has overall tracking, like single resource, single object, single owner tracking.
There also is a ton more background on the conversations in the other document that was proposed. So maybe if you could include a link to that one in our meeting agenda, and people can look at that, get some of the background, have comments for and comment on both of these proposals.
Sure. The link to that doc exists in the auth setup doc as well, but I'll add it here in the notes.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. So, Eric, do we have people on the line who want to talk about LDAP and enterprise Kubernetes control?
Yeah, I've got Ray Wang here, who actually worked extensively on Google Cloud Platform's authorization and on our tenancy, and actually one of the people I consulted with when we were first starting out with Kubernetes, trying to design RBAC, and had some good insight. So I'm pleased to have Ray Wang here to talk about a proposal for hierarchy, I guess, and automation of namespaces. Go ahead, Ray.
Hi, I also want to introduce the other Ray. We come in a pair. Ray Culling is my tech lead on a project. We wrote this document together. As we kind of over the last years, we've been talking with enterprise customers, both using GCP as well as just using kind of Kubernetes for on-prem or across cloud. One thing that stands out is that they see this dilemma of both wanting to have a single cluster so they can, being packed, as well as having a single management entity where they can, have a one consistent rollout and upgrade strategy, but at the same time wanting to have granularity of policy control at the namespace level for, multi-tenancy applications, or for kind of the separation between their own departments, or sometimes between their own internal work and the customers' workloads. And then kind of today, both in Kubernetes as well as in kind of GCP's GKE implementation, it's hard to get both. We've kind of you either have to choose just to shard into multiple clusters for multiple controls, or having single cluster and have less granular control as desired. So that was the motivation behind putting together the stock. Ray Culling, do you want to give a summary of the solution proposed here?
Sure. So first off, can everybody hear me? I'm not sure if this is actually working or not.
Yep.
All right.
You're
Very
good.
quiet.
Yeah.
Very sweet. Well, let me see how I can do here. I'm actually on vacation, so I'm looking at a beach. But so anyways, the goal of this is to take two things. One is to make one cluster be able to be partitioned and segmented for different workloads. And two, our customers also exclaim to us that they want to run multiple clusters because they want to run them in different regions, right? Or they want to run different workloads on them, but they want to be able to have one central point of administration. So in general, these companies tend to have one DevOps team, which may have 10 or 15 people who set up everything, but they have hundreds and hundreds of engineers that they want to take care of. And so they're thinking about how they can use Kubernetes in that kind of setup. So the thought that we have on the proposal is if we can have a central database of all namespaces, right? And so I just picked on LDAP, but it really could be anything. And you could set up a namespace there, and then a cluster could effectively look at that database as the source of truth for all namespaces. And then in addition to looking at the source of truth for namespaces, it also is looking at it for a source of truth for various authorizations. So you could think about quota, or you could think about the ability to run a particular job there. So even though the namespace may be present or active in a cluster, it may not have the ability to run any jobs there because, for example, they don't want to give capacity to, where maybe they have something in Asia where they have limited capacity. They want to be able to say, nope, this particular team and namespace can only run in US and EU. And this team can run in all clusters. And so we thought about this in terms of technically of just having the idea of, I think we called it a namespace controller, but again, I'm not a Kubernetes deep expert, but the idea is that we would have this database like LDAP sync all of the namespaces into the clusters that are subscribed to it, and then also control their access and authorization. So for LDAP, you can imagine that we create a DN for each namespace. And then through LDAP's hierarchy, we actually can start to attach policies that are hierarchical in nature through the LDAP hierarchy. And so now, when we go to authorize, the system that talks to LDAP can say, okay, this is cool. Let me go ahead and look this up, and it can use the hierarchy in the DN to give the answer. So now you could have one at the root DN that says the service account has access to everything, and you could use that to run scanning or use other centralized administration. So that's basically the gist of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's important what you said there, that it's not actually tied to LDAP, though LDAP is the thing that you're using in the examples, more that the idea would be to control hierarchical policies around namespaces potentially on different clusters through some central administration unit.
That's right. We feel that if the clusters are all enrolled, so to speak, into trusting that into saying all my source of namespaces come from this central place, right? Then you can use any number of systems behind that to be that central place. And so LDAP is one of them, but you can imagine that various cloud providers use their own inherent systems that they have that do similar activities.
I could even see someone being happy with a spreadsheet that contains a list of all the namespaces and has a bunch of columns and just syncs over to all your clusters. That would probably work well for a lot, of people.
We've heard a lot of pain from the shadow clusters or shadow resources employees just spin up, kind of on public clouds, and the admin doesn't know about it. They have to run quarterly amnesty day where people can come clean with the newly spun up cloud resources.
So quick question. Reading through the proposal here, it looks like there aren't any requirements for core Kubernetes changes.
That's also my take.
Which is
one
awesome.
One possibility would be admission controllers, although the externalized admission stuff would probably
Where's there a requirement for admission controllers?
Under the straw man for LDAP implementation, second from the bottom.
It's an authorizer. Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. And the other one would be, I think, a few like philosophy things where the core project tries to not break this kind of mental model, or that endorses or suggests or recommends around the idea of, programming down and namespaces being consistent across clusters, and not creating things that cut against the grain, or at least leaving affordances for it. I think that would be the other one, which is a little bit more of a philosophical sort of.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to understand the admission controller a little bit more. So we develop admission controllers that talk to LDAP and read the custom schema to enforce hierarchical configuration. What does that mean?
Well, I think there was two designs being considered, maybe, and they're not clear. One was that, when you try to create a namespace, it goes off and checks to see with LDAP if that's okay. And the other one was only the LDAP syncer can create namespaces. So that might be a role change. And then it just creates them from LDAP. And I don't think that one requires an admission controller at all.
Right.
Yeah. I don't see a real need for admission controller here. I got to be honest. I'm trying hard to parse that sentence.
I'm with Joe here.
Okay. So I can just give you the background. And again, this could just be my lack of understanding. But what we want to be able to do with these namespaces and these objects and attribute classes in LDAP, as picking on LDAP again, is to be able to say certain things like this namespace is allowed to do certain things and it's not allowed to do certain things. So for example, in this namespace, the only valid container registry is X, or you only can run, jobs that are of, that only can be on machines of type X, or just various things like, that you might want to lock down based upon a namespace. These are enterprise use cases that we get all the time where they want to be great. And so
I think it's interesting to actually view this in terms of, not one design, but a pattern that, as you build up, say, some restriction in terms of which containers you can run in which namespace, that knows how to actually read from a policy engine that may be backed by LDAP. I don't think that's I think, finding ways to decompose this. I'll take another example is that you propose here an authorizer as a webhook, right? An alternate design here would actually be to drive and create RBAC rules based on the information in LDAP and actually do a sync there versus actually webhook authorizer.
Having primitives that let you program down means that we can support a wide variety of use cases, including something I think Clayton mentioned as a call out here, which is supporting things driven by LDAP, but also supporting someone implementing the same policy just by themselves. And so the primitive, if we support those primitives and you can program those down from LDAP or manually or from some other source, it's powerful, and it lets the individual clusters coast. Instead of having 8 points of failure, where if any of the central LDAP things are down, suddenly you can't do anything on your cluster. You apply policy to that.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Again, LDAP is literally just a straw man. Sure. I hope we can put any database back. Right.
Yeah, there's a philosophical design here of really a sort of loose pushing of policy down instead of a live sort of syncing, and decomposing the features so that they can be mix or match and be have independent utility outside of the scenarios that you have here.
One thing for the admission stuff that could be interesting, I think the team that was looking at some of the OPA policy had demoed something, I want to say 6 months ago here. So if you scroll down on the notes, you can probably find a link to that. But I think Clayton was talking to them about possibly putting together an admission plugin that would take just an OPA policy. And so you could use that to program down, distribute the policies that you wanted on a particular cluster.
But let me just ask one question again for my clarification. So in terms of RBAC, the webhook versus RBAC authorizer, which I think might be related here, is that you talked about syncing RBAC policies into clusters versus having them call out to a webhook authorizer, right? How do we make that reliable in terms of the fact that our users expect that when they go ahead and at the LDAP or the backend database level turn off an authorization, that reliably gets pushed into all the clusters?
So in general, the rule of thumb here is that when everybody says they want it to take place immediately, the dirty little secret in enterprise software is that what they really mean is within 5 minutes or within 10 minutes or within an hour. And so usually, and again, like this can vary, like don't get me wrong on this. There's a little bit more of a, when you actually start digging into these scenarios, it's been my experience that you can push back and say, well,
no, I understand. I think what I'm worried about is it automatically implies some sort of reconciliation system has to be in place, right?
And
I mean, that's how Kubernetes works. Kubernetes is all about reconciliation and controller loops and continually driving towards synchronization.
And I'll say this, I don't think, I mean, I'm not personally opposed to a webhook callout model. I do think that a useful default is reconciliation, but it comes with a lot of edge cases, and we want to make those edge cases less sharp and have tools that make it easy to do reconciliation cleanly. But there will always be cases like external admission, external webhook. Those are all very reasonable. One of the challenges with admission and external webhooks is that they don't give you any tools to go deal with the fact that policies change over time. And so you can do things like say, hey, this person can't access the cluster anymore, but it doesn't give you any tools to say the thing that the person did when they were authenticated also is not working if they put a secret in place. So usually anything that deals with admission or external webhooks still needs some sort of reconciliation policy.
Yeah. You need to be able to audit what's there, yeah.
My preference is to use an object as opposed to a webhook whenever we think we can reasonably enumerate the set of policies we need. And we only fall back on a webhook when people really wanted to do something, but they couldn't tell us what they wanted to do. So that's where we used the image policy thing, right? People didn't know what they wanted, but they knew they wanted to do something.
So I'll give you a concrete example. I mean, if you build it into RBAC, I mean, people are going to do things like build dry run tools of like, I'm going to do this, will it work or won't it work, right? You build that into a webhook, it ends up being a black box.
So that's all. I mean, I really appreciate that because it was hard to tell for me, like reading in what the kind of overall sentiment is. So I definitely will appreciate that.
So practically though, I think, there's nothing to stop you folks from sort of like, creating a, Google / enterprise sync or auth sync and, go to town, right? I mean, write some code.
Yeah, I like the conceit of driving namespace creation and quota and policy for the things we support, driving that via some external source of truth, and possibly where it makes sense, pairing it with callouts if the existing primitives that we support are insufficient, or you have other kind of specialized policies that aren't cleanly expressed in objects. I think that is a good direction to drive.
Yeah, I think a little open source project that just like don't even worry about if the LDAP integration is hard. Just put it in whatever kind of database you can, a spreadsheet, exact CSV file, whatever.
YAML file, yeah.
Yeah, and then just show this pattern that shows a couple of key things like quota, namespace creation, and then the basic initial RBAC roles for those namespaces. Show that pattern, and then we can start to come back to us and talk about, okay, now I need to add image policy. Now I need to add pod security policy. How do I want to add all those things?
Yeah, and I think this is a great way to actually scope out where are we missing the extensibility hooks to be able to do this stuff on the outside.
And the dirty little secret too is that things like control apply and all of those should work on both cluster scoped and regular scoped resources the same way. And if they don't, we need to go fix them. And that pattern is something we want to be able to do bounded scoping for, like to be able to say, like, I'm going to go apply all these RBAC rules, whether they're cluster scoped or namespace scoped, or whether you're creating the namespaces yourself. Most of the time, those are things that we should be able to just make work through apply.
And if you build this and you show people are using it, we will add more stuff to Kubernetes core as needed for you to call in, declaratively to configure it the way you want it. So we will try to avoid the webhooks, I think, and add things if it makes sense.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, I think a great pattern here is the CoreOS DEX stuff as a way of having an external project that integrates with a bunch of the Kubernetes stuff, not as a controller, but as sort of like something that can live on its own that brings in a lot of this sensibility. And
it's also sort of centralized and kind of addresses like the identity federation a little bit. I think there's a neat overlap here with like right now, kubefed creates namespaces if they're missing in all the things. This thing would be taking that over from kubefed. I think they can play together, but I kind of think like this thing is the better place to own that than kubefed.
Yeah, we actually, Nikhil and I talked a little bit about this. Like, I don't know that we brought it up in the last one, but the design model that I'm hearing a lot is most people want central LDAP for identity. And in any model where you're mapping that in, there's a very useful intersection between who has access to these clusters is managed independently from what roles you have on the clusters, which is managed independently from what the federation can do. And so done right, you can have two separate systems that both have to confirm that you're authenticated to do certain things to ensure that, like, instead of just having, you compromise the federation and you take over the entire world, you might not be able to log in to the underlying clusters. Or you can log in, but the webhook policy for authorization forces you into a lower privileged role no matter what. And those sorts of things lined up together mean, even at the very largest scales, you don't have to change patterns, you just add more protections.
So another contrast with the kubefed stuff is the kubefed stuff, if I'm not wrong, is like a push model where you have a centralized thing that has keys to everything. Whereas with this type of model, you could run a synchronized controller on each cluster that reads out to LDAP and has overlapping policy that it verifies. And so it ends up being a pull model, and it can be, so this means that you don't necessarily have one place where you have the keys for all clusters.
Yeah, enrolling could be running this controller which talks to LDAP and talks to the local cluster.
The mention of LDAP reminds me of another pattern at Google, which I think works well, which we might want to promote with Kubernetes, is in the Google internal equivalent of Kubernetes, every engineer with every person with the appropriate job title has basically, when they start on day one, they get a namespace created for them that is named after their username, and that they have a limited set of resources and they have constraints on what they can do, but they get to use exactly the same system as is production. And this has, but every production account has its own namespace as well, every production role, and it has plenty of resources to do its production thing. But the beauty is that the same way that like Docker, when you build the image on your laptop or you run it on a Kubernetes cluster, it's the same Docker image, it's hermetic. Kind of the experience of developing and using Kubernetes is also hermetic in the sense that when I'm playing around, I'm using Kubernetes the same ways I use it in production. I think it's a powerful pattern, and just LDAP reminded me of that.
And then one other pattern we've seen a little bit kind of in the GCP projects, but I think will probably reflect in Kubernetes as well, is admins more and more are getting to the model where they don't actually allow their developers to just create kind of raw resources on their own. They templatize things. So, with the GCP projects, we have customers who have built a dozen internal templates. And those, if they have to, sort of policies have to be applied and have to draw in certain things, and those are done in the templatization, the creation phase, to make sure they're not those shadow projects lingering out there. The other thing I want to ask a question about is we're starting to see customers coming to us, and they're kind of confused about the thing that affects whether something can talk to something else, somebody can talk to something, is a result of many different policies that have different data models starting different places and starting to ask about how to debug kind of across these different policies. Is that a concern here, kind of between the RBAC and then some of the other plugin systems? And I would imagine, you also would have storage systems that are not a part of Kubernetes and that get permission from somewhere else. And networking policies as well.
Yeah, so there are a lot of layers where you might have permission to create an object, but then the resulting object gets denied because of quota, or the resulting object gets created, but then it can't talk to anything because of network policy. And so there are a lot of layers where things can run up against ACL boundaries or policy boundaries. There is a proposal for like advanced auditing, which is trying to tie together more end-to-end information. It doesn't connect all of those layers, but it helps, especially with the API layers, so that you would be able to see, oh, this was allowed because this authorizer allowed it because of this role bound this way. So there's basic audit in place now, but there's a proposal for improving that and trying to tie together some of those layers and bring out more of those details.
There's also a proposal to like be able to store secrets in an external, like outside of Kubernetes' secret store. And so like, suppose you have some like production thing that needs to like talk to GitHub and talk to like, a AWS, S3 bucket. Like you might store the credentials it needs for those external services somewhere external. And then you might have this, like you might list those in LDAP, for example, and then say like, okay, you need this key ring for this namespace, and then sync those secrets in or indirectly provide access to them as part of the definition of that namespace.
That's definitely needed as well. It's a frequent exploit to when people put their keys in the open GitHub projects, and then we have sad customers who who get charged for a lot of VM spam by those service accounts. So we have a lot of kind of sad customers about trying to debug, like what are all the policies that I need to flip for something to access something or to stop something from accessing something, to the point where we're starting to consider like maybe building, indexing all those policies, or at least a central place you can go and say, what are other things that might affect this particular, VM or pod or something.
Yeah, and we want to have better, I think one of the challenges is we started from the assumption that we want to have a lot of tools that can be used together and provide the most power for people. And some of like the happy path, like no razor blades flows are pre-configuration or examples or things that we haven't really thought of and created yet that walk people through unfolding those ideas so that they don't have to necessarily know it all up front. I don't think, I haven't seen a lot of magic. It's more just being able to communicate concepts pretty cleanly and then explain how they mean in an incremental, what they mean in an incremental fashion.
I actually think, some guidance for users, and we should be clear on this, is that the namespace is the thing, right? Like network policy within any sort of like policy that restricts things within a namespace is going to be error prone and probably subject to confused deputies and all sorts of other things. And so where at all possible, guiding users to say, view the namespace as your security boundary, then things will be a lot cleaner. And if we had some solution that we could point to for service-to-service authentication, then there'd be much less need for the network policy stuff, which I think is
Joe, where's Spiffy? Why haven't you finished Spiffy yet?
So I started a company around Kubernetes instead of a company around Spiffy, but Sunita James is driving some of this stuff, and there are sort of discussions and process going on there. I haven't brought it up to this group just because it's not baked enough, but we're going to need it, especially if we look at things like every time you have a webhook, we end up with like a mess of new TLS flags that nobody understands, right? So Spiffy is useful not only for stuff running on Kubernetes, but also for stitching together Kubernetes itself.
Yeah, and a lot of the, go ahead.
So the way I've been thinking about it is namespaces like form the security boundary for humans that collaborate, but service accounts, which are scoped to namespaces, are used by those equally trusted humans to further scope stuff that runs in that namespace, including like if you run like a front end and a back end and the whole team runs both, you might choose to like use two service accounts to provide service to service identity amongst the many microservices that you manage.
But service accounts won't give you service to service identity.
I think they will.
How?
If
I don't want to give
all
that.
pods have service accounts, and all service accounts have an identity, and all services can check each other's identity, then you're in a good spot.
No, they can't. I mean, like, I'm not going to give that JWT to anybody.
Yeah, please don't do that.
It needs to be an it needs to be an X509 so that it can't get replayed.
Okay, so now you're talking about Spiffy.
Yeah, and I think that's where
there's some slight disagreements with Spiffy, but yes.
Well,
but basically, yes.
That we need something that actually works outside of the Kubernetes cluster also.
I know we're almost out of time. Just to go back to the debuggability statement, that's one of the reasons we prefer policy expressed in objects over policy enforced through opaque webhooks. If you're chaining together 2 or 3 webhooks to do something, and something goes wrong or something is allowed that you don't expect, well, suddenly you have to go to the other system and talk to the administrator of the webhook and try to figure out like what is even behind this thing. Whereas if the policy is declared in objects, you actually can inspect and debug and say, okay, well, what are my policies and what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to have a namespace that like get all effective policies. That returns kind of, you know, the RBAC and the networking and all those things, and then you can debug on top of that.
Yep, there's actually a proposal, maybe even an open poll to do that for RBAC, like list effective rules for a user, and having similar tools for the other policies would be good. Yeah.
Yep. The whole infrastructure as code thing, like, you know, I think it's very powerful. Kubernetes declarative APIs are great. We need more of them. And the whole syncing thing fits in with the whole infrastructure as code. And LDAP is just the revision control system for your, you know, infrastructure code.
Yeah, personally, I would start with a CSV syncer, right? That's probably a weekend's worth of work to do something interesting there.
Yeah.
Or if you like Google, you can do a Google Sheets.
Well, the API for Google Sheets is just god awful.
Right, so we're pretty much out of time. There's one last design PR that I did see, which is about securing the security model for user-facing services. This is notably has a little bit of overlap with the threat models design proposal that Clayton put together. I haven't taken a huge look into that, but for anybody interested in that space, go take a look. Yeah.
There's a really good discussion between Quentin and Clayton, so feel free to jump in there.
Yeah. Also, Joe, if you want to link your Spiffy doc here, that could also probably be appreciated. Cool. Yeah. So thanks everybody for joining. The next meeting will be in 2 weeks, and please drop items in here that you'd like to talk about. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.